Okay, good evening and welcome to this class that's in the series on fundamental wisdom called Discovering the Middle Way. And so we finished the text, and tonight we'll be continuing doing a second evening of meditation on emptiness with a little teaching ahead of it around dependent arising, because we're going to do meditation on dependent arising. So let me go ahead and pull up the prayers, and then we can do the prayers together and a short meditation, and then we'll begin the class. So as usual, I'm going to recite these prayers together all in English tonight, other than the refuge prayer, which we'll do once in English, twice in Tibetan. So let's recite the praise to Shakyamuni Buddha 3 times to begin with. To the founder, the endowed, transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, endowed, transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. To the founder, the endowed, transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed, transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. To the founder, the endowed, transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed, transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakyan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. And the short mandala offering, again, imagining the entire phenomenal world transformed into a beautiful Buddha paradise, this pure land of a Buddha that we're offering to receive the blessings of the gurus, the Buddhas, so we can become just like them and lead all beings to having this same purified state. This ground anointed with perfume, strewn with flowers, adorned with Mount Meru, 4 continents, the sun and the moon. I imagine this as a Buddha field and offer it. May all living beings enjoy this pure land. Idam Guru Ratna Mandalakam Niryatayami. Then refuge in bodhicitta, once in English, twice in the Tibetan. I go for refuge until I am enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merit I create by listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. Sangye chodang uki choknam la jangchu bardu dakni kyabsu chi daki chunyen gipe sonam gi Dola Penchir Sangye Drupar Shog Sangye Chodang Soki Choknam La Jangchu Bardu Dakni Kyabsu Chi Daki Chunyen Gipe Sonam Gi Dola Penchir Sangye Drupar Shog. Okay, good. Let's do a short meditation just to focus the mind a bit before we begin, as well as to spend a few minutes meditating on bodhicitta so that we make that motivation very firm in our hearts. So find a good meditation posture, one that's suitable for you, making sure the back is somewhat straight, upright, and also relaxing into this posture as best as you can. And then begin to attend to the breath when you're ready, using whatever technique works for your mind in terms of working with the breath. If you need a suggestion, generally, again, I suggest the area of the nostrils where we feel the air coming in and out as we inhale, as we exhale. But whatever way you're working with the breath, the idea is to stay present with the breath as best as you can. to not allow the mind to get distracted. But certainly we will have distractions. Things will come into our mind and try to take us off somewhere. Thoughts of remembering or worries we might have, or things we might even get excited about, thinking about various pleasures or sense objects, what have you. Whatever it is that has kind of pulled you away from the breath, when you see that that's happened, let it go. You don't have to continue to follow it. Make that choice to return back to the breath. So I'll ring the bowl here to begin the meditation period. And again, we'll do just a few minutes in silence, and then I'll lead you in a short reflection to set your motivation for tonight. So now let's set our motivation of bodhicitta together. And recall that this mind is a very courageous mind. It's a mind that sees the suffering of the world, having recognized first our own suffering, the difficulties that we ourselves experience and have been experiencing since beginningless time, going from life to life in samsara. Having seen it for ourselves, we then translate that for others. We can infer that every single being in this world, all the beings that are in samsara, although their individual situation might be very different, they are in the same predicament as ourselves. So bodhicitta is a mind that is based on that understanding that there's essentially no difference between myself and others, between any of the beings that exist in samsara. We're all in the same situation, all in the same boat. You know, we've been hearing that a lot these days with the epidemic going on, that we're all in this together. Well, to some extent, this is true about samsara. It's just that most beings don't have a clue about how to get out of this state. on the other hand, we ourselves have met with the Dharma, not only the Dharma of the individual vehicle that will lead to our own liberation from suffering, but the Dharma of the universal vehicle, the Mahayana, that can lead to the end of suffering for all sentient beings when we have that motivation of achieving enlightenment for the sake of those beings. And moreover, we've also met with the Vajrayana, this extremely rare and precious Dharma that is taught within the Tibetan Buddhist tradition that gives us the tool to become enlightened even more quickly for the benefit of others. So we ourselves are in an unbelievably fortunate situation. While yes, we are identical to others in our fundamental predicament, what's unique about ourselves, those gathered here tonight, is the great blessings that we've had to be able to meet with this path that will lead not just ourselves out of our own suffering, but will help us to attain Buddhahood so we can then accomplish that for all sentient beings. So really feel how amazingly fortunate and blessed you are at this time to have the Dharma to rely upon, to have the deep refuge in the three jewels and the Guru as the opportunity, it's what will help us to achieve this state. So really feel that you're in a unique situation within the larger predicament that we all find ourselves in. So while it is here for us at this time, while we still have this human life and still have the access to the Dharma that we've had, it's best to make the ideal use of this time, to be very courageous, to recognize that it's our chance now to do everything we can to help all sentient beings by turning our minds towards the Dharma, especially the topic of emptiness that we're pursuing in these classes, which is essential. And developing that wisdom is the only thing that will eventually liberate all beings from their suffering and help them to attain Buddhahood. So again, with all those thoughts in mind, the real feeling of being very fortunate, but moreover, what comes with that, the responsibility then to use this life, and especially the time we have together tonight, as best as we can, so we can then bring all sentient beings to the state of enlightenment by becoming a Buddha ourselves. And hold that motivation of bodhicitta very firmly in your heart, so that everything we do tonight becomes a cause for that result. Okay, wonderful. So again, what I'm doing with these classes now, or this opportunity now, is to kind of work with the teachings on emptiness to some degree. So we're going to use Nagarjuna's verses again as a starting point for tonight's meditation as well. And then to kind of use the instruction that we've received from other great masters, and I'm using His Holiness primarily tonight, to look at how we meditate on these topics of emptiness and the various reasoning. So last week we looked at the 4-point analysis, and again, a copy of the meditation that comes from the Discovering Buddhism module had been posted to the Dropbox for this course by Mary. Thank you, Mary, for doing that. And then tonight, there's not really a formal written up meditation on dependent arising other than one that I had managed to find that Venerable Rabina wrote up for a book called Spiritual Friends, which is a book that was put together by monks and nuns of the IMI, the International Mahayana Institute, which is FPMT's monastic organization. So I have used that in the past, and it's all written up, and I will send that on to Mary, but it's really just a piece of what we're going to do tonight, and it goes into much more detail around looking at the body in particular, our bodies, and seeing how they are dependent arising. So anyway, that one will be out there later, but I just didn't put anything out there yet. So let's go ahead and take a look then at the slides that I put together for tonight. Let me need to get that one thing out of the way for me to put on the slideshow here. So again, in last week's class, we looked at the 4-point analysis, which you can review online, and these teachings will be also posted online at YouTube at some point. So I'm not going to review that tonight. I may tell you the points as we go through tonight. Tonight's topic is realizing selflessness. using the reasoning of dependent arising, which is actually said to be the king of reasonings. Again, most of you who were attending the classes in this course, when we went through Nagarjuna's verses, this is the main gist of Nagarjuna's text, is that dependent arising is the means by which we can see the reality of emptiness. It focuses on how things arise, how they arise in dependence upon various factors. And by virtue of that, it negates them abiding in an independent way, a way that they are unrelated to anything else. So this is the topic that we're looking at tonight, which is again said to be the king of reasonings because it keeps us from falling into the extreme that we're currently in of reifying things, holding tightly to things as if they existed intrinsically, independently. And it also keeps us from moving away or from falling into the extreme of nihilism, of thinking that things don't exist at all, especially because this is showing how things actually do exist. If we understand the very subtle way of how things actually exist, we can negate a fictitious way of existing, but we can also still maintain their existence in the midst of emptiness. So the two verses that I've chosen, of course, we went through these not that long ago in the course, are verses 18 and 19 from the 24th chapter, which is on the Four Noble Truths. But this is where Nagarjuna essentially spells out this really beautiful encapsulation of what we mean by emptiness and dependent arising, dependent origination. He says, whatever is dependently originated, that is explained to be emptiness. That, being a dependent designation, is itself the middle way, this emptiness that is in the middle between these two extremes, not falling into the extreme of nihilism by saying things are empty of inherent existence or independent existence. We don't deny their mere existence. By saying that they are empty of that, we also, though, do deny any of their intrinsic existence. So again, this is something that is useful for us to know, is that we are with the reasoning of dependent arising, dependent origination, we are able to clearly articulate and find within our minds that middle way, that path that's exactly between these two extremes, that doesn't allow you to fall into either one. So emptiness itself and dependent origination are said to be kind of two sides of the same coin. One looking at how things actually exist, dependent origination, and the other looking at how they lack any independent existence, any inherent existence. So the next verse follows from that, the very next one, verse 19 in chapter 24. That which is not dependently originated, such a thing doesn't exist. In other words, everything that exists in dependence upon things. It originates from other factors. And we're going to look at what those are before we get into the meditation, just to review that for everyone. Therefore, that which is not empty, such a thing does not exist. Because there's nothing that lacks dependent origination. There's nothing that has any that lacks emptiness. Everything is empty. Everything is dependently originated. Even emptiness itself is dependently originated. Emptiness doesn't have some reified quality itself. It is a relational phenomenon. It is related to the phenomena that it's referring to, and the emptiness of a pot, for example, refers to that pot and refers to a specific thing that pot lacks. And so everything is designated, dependently originated. We'll get into the subtleties of this in a moment. So again, I'm using His Holiness's wonderful book, How to See Yourself as You Are, to go into this. He says in this, if the mistaken view that people and things exist independently is the cause of all other counterproductive views and emotions, then one of the principal means of overcoming this mistaken outlook is to reflect on the fact that all phenomena arise dependently. So we can see how these two are counter to each other, that if you have a belief in things existing independently, to show that they are dependent would counteract that, would be opposed to that. Then he goes on to say, through reflecting on dependent arising, then, you will lose the belief that things exist in and of themselves, on their own, independent, inherently. And then this carries over to the next slide, some verses from Nagarjuna from a different text. He says, the apprehension of inherent existence is the cause of all unhealthy views. Afflictive emotions are not produced without this error. Of course, this is the gist of why we need to eliminate the ignorance adhering to independent existence, is because it's the cause of all of our unhealthy views. All the afflictive emotions are produced with that error. They cannot be produced without that error. If we get rid of that error, We get rid of all the afflictive emotions. We no longer have craving and desire and grasping. We no longer have anger, aversion, hatred. We no longer have jealousy and pride and all the other delusions. Therefore, when emptiness is thoroughly known, unhealthy views and afflictive emotions are thoroughly pacified. So this is the whole gist of it, is that if we actually know emptiness at the deepest level through thorough knowledge, through absolute, the final knowledge of that occurs when we realize it directly, then all the unhealthy views and afflictive emotions will be pacified. Even with some understanding of emptiness, we can begin to limit the amount of those afflictions arising. But we can get rid of them completely and pacify them when we know emptiness directly. Through what is emptiness known? Or by way of what is emptiness known, is known through seeing dependent arising. The Buddha, the supreme knower of reality, said, what is dependently produced is not inherently produced or independently produced. And I think this is what we're going to meditate on next week in the final Wednesday night class in the series, is to look at the lack of inherent production. But certainly we're already going to look at it tonight in terms of how things arise on the basis of their causes and conditions, but we'll do a slightly different analysis for next week. So then His Holiness, in another book that I frequently cite these verses or these pages on dependent arising that are in the book Ethics in the New Millennium. It's kind of interesting. It's more of a secular book, but nonetheless, it has a lot of teachings on dependent arising and other Buddhist concepts. So he says, I find the concept of dependent origination or dependent arising, which in Tibetan is Tendro, articulated by the Madhyamika, the middle way school of Buddhist philosophy, to be particularly helpful. According to this, we can understand how things and events come to be in three different ways. So again, many of you have heard these teachings on this idea before. I even went through it when we went through the course, but I'm going to review them again and use His Holiness's words to help us to explore these. The first is dependence upon causes and conditions, which refers only to impermanent phenomena. And we're going to meditate on impermanent phenomena tonight when we do the meditation shortly. Dependence upon parts and dependence upon conceptuality, the second and the third, apply to all phenomena, both impermanent and permanent. What we mean by impermanent are phenomena that arise and change moment by moment. There's momentary change. They don't last for a single instant. And this is everything that is produced in our world, everything that arises from causes and conditions. So our bodies are impermanent phenomena. Our minds are impermanent phenomena. Everything in our physical world, all the form that's visual, the sounds that we hear, the tastes and smells that we have, all the tactile sensations, all the things in our phenomenal world that induce those various sensations, they are all impermanent. But there are some permanent phenomena. I went through these in the class. Usually there are like four that are set out. One is uncomposed or uncompounded space. Two of them, the other two are analytical cessations and non-analytical cessations. These are phenomena that don't change moment by moment. And then finally, the fourth one that is frequently taught is selflessness, emptiness. So emptiness itself is a permanent phenomenon, meaning that the emptiness of I, the person right now, that each of you have an I that you're referring to, the emptiness of that I does not change moment by moment. It is a negation, and thereby it stays the same in terms of until the I goes out of existence, then the emptiness of I would go out of existence. So it is coextensive and exists at the same time as the phenomenon it's related to, but emptiness itself is a permanent phenomenon when it can be in relation to an impermanent phenomenon, but it's an unchanging phenomenon. Anyway, we'll get into this a little bit as we go through this. The two other that are mentioned there, again, dependence upon parts and dependence upon conceptuality, which we can also say could be called imputation, designation, labeling. These two again refer to all phenomena. Even emptiness itself is dependent upon conceptuality, dependent upon its parts. It doesn't have causes and conditions, so it doesn't exist in the first way. But nonetheless, for those phenomena that are impermanent, they have all three of these. And we'll be going through that tonight when we do the meditation. So let's look at these Initially, the introduction that comes from Jeffrey Hopkins' book, Emptiness Yoga, he says, dependence upon causes and conditions is narrower. Dependence upon parts is as wide as everything in all the universes. Dependence upon an imputing consciousness, though just as wide in its scope of application, is more difficult to realize. So this is how they are traditionally set out. But as I've pointed out in this class, even dependence upon causes and conditions actually points to the same truth. Dependence upon parts and dependence upon an imputing consciousness or a conceptuality, these two also, are pointing to the reality of things existing in a very subtle way. But as I pointed out previously, and I'm not going to go into it in great depth right now, but even the lower schools will hold to dependence upon causes and conditions as a reality for all impermanent phenomena, but they don't see emptiness of inherent existence when they realize that or when they observe that. So in the Madhyamika presentation, the middle way presentation, this is how they are laid out. That dependence upon causes and conditions is narrower because it only applies to impermanent phenomena. Dependence upon parts is as wide as everything in all the universes. It applies to everything. Dependence upon conceptuality or an imputing consciousness, though just as wide in its scope of application, is more difficult to realize. It is the final way that we realize that things exist in terms of their ability to be established conventionally. So let's look at these each. Again, I've maybe got more slides than what I need to, but I do want to spend a little bit of time talking about it, and we'll try to have our meditation by 7:30, so we have about 45 minutes of meditation. Dependent arising upon, this first one, dependence upon causes and conditions, this refers to the fact that all impermanent phenomena, whether they are physical, mental, or otherwise, come into existence dependent upon certain causes and conditions. So everything that is impermanent arises on the basis of its causes and conditions. Whatever arises dependent upon certain causes and conditions is not operating exclusively under its own power. So what His Holiness is meaning by this is that this is one way that we often talk about things existing inherently, is that they exist under their own power. They exist from their own side by way of their own characteristics. The idea is that they're able to self-establish. Their identity is established from the side of the object. Well, if they depend upon other factors for their existence, their causes and conditions, and they don't have their own power, they aren't self-established. They're established by virtue of all the causes and conditions that have led them to appear in that particular phenomenon that we designate as something. So this is the idea behind it, is that we couldn't have inherent existence, separate existence, if things arise even from causes and conditions. It's belied by virtue of that because things have to rely upon something else. Sometimes this is even called dependent reliance, that things have to rely upon other factors for them to come into existence. So as I pointed out in this course, even this very first level that we're looking at now of dependence upon causes and conditions points to emptiness of inherent existence. Because if things had an independent existence, then they wouldn't need to rely upon their causes and conditions. But nothing whatsoever has an independent existence, has inherent existence. This is the truth of what the Buddha taught, that what we have been believing in since beginningless time does not exist at all. So at this first level, this is going back to Ethics in the New Millennium, His Holiness says, the principle of cause and effect, whereby all things and events arise in dependence on a complex web of interrelated causes and conditions, is invoked. So this term things is actually, there's a word, functioning things, that's a category of phenomena that refers to impermanent things. So all those impermanent things and events arise in dependence on a complex web of interrelated causes and conditions. That nothing sort of stands alone. It says here, this suggests that no thing or event can be construed as capable of coming into or remaining in existence by itself. It has to depend upon other factors. So these functioning things, these things in our world that are produced from their causes and conditions, depend upon those causes and conditions. For example, For example, I take some clay and mold it, I can bring a pot into being. The pot exists as an effect of my actions. At the same time, it is also the effect of a myriad of other causes and conditions. These include the combination of clay and water to form its raw material. Sometimes we call it the substantial cause. The substantial cause of a pot is the clay and water that are combined that make the moldable, substance by which the pot comes into existence. They are the most substantial cause to it, but it requires obviously a lot of other conditions. whoops, sometimes when I hit it once, it goes twice. Beyond this, we can point to the coming together of the molecules, atoms, and other minute particles, which form these constituents, which are themselves dependent on innumerable other factors. So you have a whole set of causes and conditions that have led to the clay being there, that are the molecules of the clay, that have arisen from their causes and conditions, other factors that are involved in them. Then there are the circumstances leading up to my decision to make a pot. And there are the cooperative conditions of my actions as I give shape to the clay. All these different factors make it clear that my pot cannot come into existence independently of its causes and conditions. Rather, it is dependently originated. So something as simple as a clay pot requires many, many factors. And of course, we can extend this out, as Venerable Robina does in her meditation on the body, to think about all the various things that contributed to it as well, right? So if we talk about the clay that goes into a pot, well, that clay had to have been drawn from the ground in which it was produced, has to be all of the various things that come into feeding into the ground that produce the clay, all of the water, all of the sunshine, all of the various elements that are involved in all of that. And then if you talk about the people who are getting the clay and putting it into packages so you can mold it into a pot, well, then those people had many factors in terms of them coming into existence so that they could then do that for you. We find an infinite number of causes and conditions involved in any one particular phenomenon that we've identified. So this is the reality for this produced world that we live in, everything arising from myriad causes and conditions. So then dependence upon parts, the second layer of the second level. Dependent arising, His Holiness says, also refers to the fact that all phenomena, both impermanent and permanent, as I said earlier, exist in dependence upon their own parts. Everything has parts. And of course, we can think about the physical world, what we might call spatial parts, that there are, various things that feed into it, components, if you will, that produce a phenomenon. But then even when we talk about things that aren't material, such as consciousness, which we'll have a slide for, there's, parts of that as well. We might call temporal parts, moments of this stream of awareness or consciousness. So a pot, for instance, again, a material object, exists in dependence upon its parts, whether we consider the coarse parts, such as the lid, handle, or opening, or subtle parts, such as molecules, as he mentioned in the earlier one in terms of causes and conditions. We can also see them as parts. The various parts of the clay pot are also the molecules of clay, of whatever substance that form the clay. Without its essential parts, His Holiness says, a pot simply cannot be. It does not exist in the concrete, independent way that it seems to. So nothing exists without its parts, especially these physical objects, and we can point to them and very easily see the various parts or components that have led to that being there in front of us. So then back to ethics in the new millennium, in that text, His Holiness says, on the second level, tendra, can be understood in terms of the mutual dependence which exists between parts and the whole. Without parts, there can be no whole. Without a whole, the concept of parts makes no sense. So this is dependent arising at this level. We can already begin to see the mutual dependence going on here between the parts, which are like the parts of a, well, let's use, we had pot, but let's use my hand, the parts of a hand. So we have the palm of the hand, we have the thumb, we have the index finger, the middle finger, the ring finger, the little finger, we have the back of the hand, we have the front of the hand, and so on. You have all the various parts, and of course there are many parts within this. We have the carpals and the metacarpals and all these bones. You have all the various capillaries and veins flowing through the hand and to the fingers and what have you. You have the nerve endings. You have so many different parts of this, and the fingernails, what have you. All of these parts of a hand are what constitute the whole that we call hand. Hand and the parts of a hand have a mutual dependence. Without talking about the parts of a hand, you can't talk about hand. Without talking about hand, you can't talk about the parts of the hand. This is true for anything that we call a whole and anything called the parts. So you can do that with regard to all the phenomena around us in the world. as simplistic as things might be, you might look at a leaf and you go, well, oh, but it's just a leaf. But a leaf is dependent upon the edges of the leaf, the flat surfaces of the leaf, the veins in the leaf, the color of the leaf, all the various things that constitute it that you then label and talk about it as leaf. And this is pointing already to this very subtle way that we see that things are merely labeled or designated. Already when we start talking about the whole and the parts, the hand and the parts of the hand, we begin to see this interdependence going on, that nothing can exist as a whole completely independent of its parts. Of course, nor can the parts exist completely independent of the whole. That's why we talk about these as being parts of a hand. But anything that we look at then as a part of the whole of hand also is a whole in and of itself. Here's index finger in front of you now. Index finger has many parts to it, right? We can talk about the, I don't know, they have a name for these in biology. I wasn't very good, or physiology. This part of the finger, the middle part of the finger, the top part of the finger. You can talk about once more the fingernail, the back of the finger, the front of the finger, you know, all the various things that are involved in my index finger. And then if we take a single part of the index finger, such as the nail, it's got the curved bottom part that's recessed inside there. You have the outer part that is exposed. You have, you know, the sides of it, and so on. You keep going down and you see that there are, everything is that we establish has a wholeness to it based on the parts that constitute that. So this is, again, pointing to this subtler way that we're going to get to, the subtlest way that when we talk about it, when we get to the third level. But His Holiness reiterates this idea. He says the idea of whole is predicated on parts, but these parts themselves must be considered to be wholes comprised of their own parts. What about, he does raise a few questions that some of the lower schools object to. He says, what about the atomic particles that are the building blocks of larger objects? Could they be partless? So this is some of the ancient Buddhist schools would establish these things called partless particles, which would be something that is able to abide on its own without any parts. But His Holiness says this too is impossible, since if a particle did not have spatial extent, it could not combine with other particles to form a larger object, right? Because even what they're finding, and as I understand it, and looking down at, you know, atomic and subatomic particles, they're not finding anything that is completely partless. Even the subtlest things they can find that maybe they can't divide up and find subtler parts of it, still has spatial parts around it. Particle physicists, His Holiness says, believe that even the tiniest particle can be broken down into smaller parts if we can create tools powerful enough to do so. This is where they found quarks and subquarks and so on. I don't know where they're at with this whole process. I'm not on top of that. But he says, but even if they somehow found a physically unbreakable entity, it would still have spatial extent and thus parts. Otherwise, it could not combine with other such entities to form anything larger. So again, the idea here being that if you have something that is on its own as some sort of partless phenomenon, that means it can't be broken down, but it can't be absolutely partless because you couldn't put another part next to it for those to build up into larger particles. So this is the gist of that, and why that's denied that something at that deeper level could be absolutely partless. Then someone might question too about consciousness, and this is where I was saying earlier, consciousness doesn't have spatial parts. Why? Because it's not physical. So the consciousness involved in looking at a blue vase is like that. It can't have spatial parts because it's non-material, but it exists as a continuum of moments. Consciousness looking at a blue vase has earlier and later moments in its continuum. And these are parts of a stream of consciousness, no matter how short. Even if we have just a few seconds of looking at a blue vase, the consciousness that arises on the basis of that, it has come about through its various parts, the temporal parts that have led up to it that are involved in it, and that then cease when it ends. When you look at something else, or your ear consciousness is active and it's listening to something else. So then consider the briefest moments in a continuum of consciousness. If even the briefest of moments did not have a beginning, middle, and end, it could not join with other brief moments to become a continuum. It would be equally close to an earlier moment and to a later moment, in which case there would be no continuum at all. So even if we do break down temporal moments of consciousness, we don't find that any of them sort of stand alone, completely independent on their own. They are always part of a continuity, and they always have to have some sort of time element to them when they are ending so that the next moment begins. Again, albeit very subjectively delineated, but this is the reality is that things have to have some sort of temporal continuity within them, even if they're at this very, very minute level, very small level in terms of moments of consciousness. And going back to the how to see yourself as you really are, His Holiness gets into this third level, which, as I said, is already hinted at by the second level. Existing independence upon conceptuality is the most subtle meaning of dependent arising. And then he has this parenthetical information. He says, nowadays, physicists are discovering that phenomena do not exist objectively in and of themselves, but exist in the context of involvement with an observer. So we've all heard this in terms of scientists are coming to recognize that they, as an observer of the phenomena that they are analyzing, that they are testing, and so on, become a part of the equation. That observer is involved in what is being observed in bringing things into existence, that there aren't things that exist completely independent of the observer. This is the idea that is taken to its greatest dimension in terms of Madhyamika Buddhist philosophy. So, for example, His Holiness uses his own I, sense of I. The Dalai Lama's I must be within this area where my body is. There is no other place it could possibly be found. Again, we went through that analysis last week with the 4-point analysis, determining that the body-mind complex would be the more likely place where we could find this truly existent I, this inherently independently existent I. But we do have to look other places, as we did last week, but nonetheless, this is quite true for us in terms of our experience. We always have the feeling of I wherever the body is. There's no other place it could possibly be found in terms of if it's not together with this body, then it obviously wouldn't exist in the way that we think it does, at least while in this lifetime, while consciousness is still with this body and so on. So he says this is clear, but when you investigate in this area of the body, and the mind for that matter, as we did last week, you cannot find an I that has its own substance. You don't find something existing independently here as the I. Nevertheless, we still have to say the Dalai Lama is a man, a monk, a Tibetan who can speak, drink, eat, and sleep. He's the agent of all these actions. This is sufficient proof that the Dalai Lama exists, even though he cannot be found. The essence of that I that is the Dalai Lama, that person who is the Dalai Lama, cannot be found in the body or mind, the body-mind complex, cannot be located, but still exists. So this is pointing to the fact that in the end, existence has to depend upon a very, very subtle matter, which is conceptuality, imputation, designation. This means that there is nothing to be found that is the I, but this fact does not imply that the I does not exist. In other words, we avoid inherent or nihilistic bent and thinking things don't exist. How could that be implying that the I doesn't exist? His Holiness says that would be silly. The I definitely does exist, but when it exists, it cannot be found. We have to say that it arises independence upon thought. It cannot be posited any other way, because if we can't find something that is sort of substantially there, that is identifiable as there objectively, then it has to have mere nominal existence. It has to have, if it exists at all, which of course, as His Holiness says, it would be silly to say that I don't exist, that you don't exist, that things don't exist. Obviously they exist. You know, this is the whole point to the Buddhist path, is that things do still exist, albeit in that very subtle way, nominally, independence upon thought, through designation, through conceptuality, never existing on their own from their own side, substantially. So in the Ethics in the New Millennium, His Holiness says, on the third level, all phenomena can be understood to be dependently originated because when we analyze them, we find that ultimately they lack independent identity. This can be understood from the way in which we refer to certain phenomena. For example, the words action and agent presuppose one another. So do parent and child. One cannot be a parent without having had a child. One cannot be a child without having had a parent, right? Someone is a parent only because he or she has children. Likewise, a daughter or son is so called only in relation to them having parents. The same relationship of mutual dependence is seen in the language we use to describe trades or professions. Individuals are called farmers on account of their work on the land. Doctors are so called because of their work in the field of medicine. So even how we label individual people is based on, these ideas of who they are, where their expertise is, and so on. In a more subtle way, though, and this is really hinting at the deeper level that we are referring to in this third idea of dependence upon conceptuality, things and events can be understood in terms of dependent origination when, for example, we ask, what exactly is a clay pot? Or what exactly is the eye? What exactly is anything? What do we find when we look for it at that level of investigation and analysis? When we look for something, we can describe as its final identity to find that real pot, that real eye, that real whatever. We find that the pot's very existence, and by implication that of all other phenomena, is to some extent provisional and determined by convention. When we ask whether its identity is determined by its shape, function, its specific parts, that is being compounded of clay, water, and so on, and all the various things that are involved in a pot, we find that the term pot is merely a verbal designation. There is no single characteristic which can be said to identify it. We will not find that if we investigate on that basis that we call pot, nor indeed does the totality of its characteristics, that sum, that what we call the whole, that in and of itself is not equivalent and identifiable as the real pot. Then he goes on to say, we can imagine pots of different shapes that are no less pots, and because we can only really speak of it existing in relation to a complex nexus of causes and conditions, viewed from this perspective, it has no one defining quality. It comes together on the basis of all of these things. In other words, it does not exist in and of itself, but rather is dependently originated and in the end, dependently designated. So not only His Holiness, this is again going to another text, the text that we actually used some when we went through Nagarjuna's verses, because I was using His Holiness's format in the Middle Way, the book that he wrote about these chapters of Nagarjuna. I was using the same format to go through the chapters that we've gone through in this course. His Holiness says not only are phenomena dependent on their component parts then, but if we probe among the parts, we can find nothing that we can point to and say, here is the real thing, the defining characteristic. We do not find anything that is the true referent of the idea of pot, for example, among all the parts of the pot, nor the totality of the parts of the pot, or all the characteristics and so on. Things come to be known as particular things only on the basis of their designative basis, or basis of designation, we sometimes would refer to this as. Dependent designation, then, means that things exist by way of being labeled upon a suitable basis or through worldly convention. So there is a basis for something, just as I was pointing out in regard to the parts of the hand, right? So the parts of the hand that are in front of you right now, what His Holiness is saying here is that they don't really exist as a hand. Hand is not something established by each of these parts coming together, that they have some sort of handness from the side of those parts, nor do they have a handness from the side of the collection of those, the totality of that and all their characteristics. Hand is a label that we're giving to this. There's no real hand that I'm holding up here before you. No real hand at all. Hand is only a designation, a label, a conceptuality that a concept that we give to this collection of stuff. So this is getting at the fact that things cannot have anything from their own side, because in the end, their subtlest way of existing isn't just depending upon the causes and conditions that gave rise to this hand and the body that it's attached to and so on. It isn't just arising on the basis of the parts of the hand. It's arising in dependence upon me labeling it as hand. It has no more handness than that. Any sort of inherent handness is completely negated by virtue of that. So just a few more slides and then we'll do the meditation. In other words, they are dependent on their designation by the mind conceiving them, that conceptuality, because all phenomena in the final analysis are conceptual labels applied on aggregations of certain bases. Their identity cannot be separated from the conceptual mind that labels them. In other words, it cannot be established as separate as from the side of the basis independent of the mind that labels them. This is the subtlest way that things are dependent arising. Oops. According to Nagarjuna, when we search for an essence, nothing on the part of the object can withstand critical analysis to be identified as the thing itself. Anything that we search for will reveal its nature to be thoroughly dependent. We will not find it having that independent status. Nothing stands apart as an absolute, unique, independent entity. And there are only two ways in which we can understand the existential status of things, either as possessing some kind of intrinsic independent objective reality or as dependent designations. There's no other choice. Either things exist objectively from their own side, or they exist nominally through the force of some designating consciousness. These would deny each other. And of course, the first one doesn't exist. The second one is the only thing that exists in terms of how all phenomena arise, independence upon designation. So, since an objective existence of things turns out to be untenable, the only choice left is nominal existence or reality. It is not merely that things cannot be found when sought critically. Things exist in terms of dependent designation. This is what we find. We don't find them to exist inherently. That's their emptiness. But we come around to understand then that they exist merely through designation, through imputation, labeling. And even this existence on the basis of designation can only be posited within a relative framework. No things possess independent status. Nothing whatsoever that exists has independent status. All right? Wow, I know that was a lot of slides to go through, and we're a little bit over the time I wanted to, but are there any questions before we begin the meditation? All right, well, let's go ahead and do some, because I do want to get an opportunity to have at least a meditation on the body. So this is what we're going to use as the object to analyze, because we have such a strong sense of identity with the body. We can certainly use the I. The I is a dependent arising as well, but I think it's because of the strong attachment that we have to these bodies, and especially with what we're dealing with in our world right now, where a lot of what we're doing when we're out to the grocery stores, whatever, is protecting this body, but by virtue of that, we're often protecting the I that is so attached to this body, that is identifying with this body frequently. So let's go ahead and begin with just a few minutes of silent meditation, just going back to that, meditating on the breath in whatever way suits your mind, to try to calm the mind a little bit before we begin this. And then again, I'll lead you in looking at these three levels of dependent origination in relationship to your body. So now let's do the meditation on dependent arising. And although this isn't often set out as the first step, I think it's useful to introduce the first step that we had from last week from the 4-point analysis. And I'm bringing to mind what the appearance of that inherent existent object is. And in this case, again, since we're working with the body, try to bring to mind the way that you think about your body, particularly when the body might be injured or at risk of some sort of disease, as we are dealing with currently in our world. And to see how the body appears to your mind when you bring it to the forefront and you think about it through some strong emotion of fear, wanting to protect the body. How it seems to have its own bodiness, seems to kind of cover from the top of our head down to the bottom of our feet. This whole thing that we call body seems to have its own identity established from its own side. So the goal of this meditation is to help us to undermine that strong sense of an independently existing body that can appear to us when we think about it in these ways. We want to replace it with a true understanding of the very subtle way in which the body exists. So generate that motivation for engaging in this to undermine your own ignorance that is clinging to this false object, so that you can then be free of that ignorance once and for all and help all other beings to do the same. So first, let's take a look at the beginning level of dependent origination, dependent arising, that this body, in fact, arises from many causes and conditions. In fact, we could say infinite causes and conditions. But let's start with the most substantial cause that led to this body being here. And these are the two cells of your parents, the egg cell of your mother, the sperm cell of your father. These two united in the womb of your mother, where those conditions were ripe for the womb or the egg and sperm, that combined cell to grow, to develop, all the various stages of development that it went through. But it all began with those two essences of the bodies of your parents, the sperm cell from your father, the egg cell from your mother. Even at this very basic level, we can ask the question, could there be a body that exists independent of those cells, the original cause of this body, substantially in terms of, what gave rise to it? Can we see our own body existing independent of that original cause within this life? But let's also look at all the other conditions, all the other factors that have led to you having this body right now. So after conception occurred and the fetus began to grow within the womb, that became your body, that is kind of in the whole trajectory of our body at the very beginning. We saw that there were many things that led to that growth. The division of cells and the various things that arose as the gestation continued, all of that depended greatly upon the nutrients from your mother. All the things that she ate, food that she put into her own system, which became the building blocks from which your own body was formed, that contributed to its development in the womb. We can think about where that food came from, all the sources of the food that your mother ate, the vegetables, the meat, the grains, whatever it was that she consumed, all had its various causes and conditions. Even one of them, such as the vegetables that she ate, we could say by virtue of her eating them, they had to have been grown. There had to be someone who tended to them in the fields, someone who harvested them, someone who packaged them, and so on. So many people involved, and every one of those people had their own causes and conditions. So we're just going to do a few minutes in silence where you just sort of do this free floating of seeing all the various causes and conditions that led to the development of this body in the womb of your mother throughout that time, just even picking any particular moment and seeing how it was, there were very many factors that were involved in it. Those that gave some impetus directly, such as the nutrients from your mother, but where those came from, where the food then came from, where the people who harvested the food came from, and so on. And see that there is no end to the causes and conditions that have led you to have this body. So before we move on to the next step, just check in then to see, how does the body appear to you now compared to how it appeared before you started this meditation? It seemed to have some sort of independent status. Does it feel a little less like that now? Does it appear to be a little more elusive now, because we can see that this body that we have, especially at that time when it was in the mother's womb, depended upon so many factors, even dependent upon the breathing of your mother, the air that she breathed in, and so on, all the various things, the blood that was pumping through her heart, the iron that she ate that allowed the blood to do what it needed to do, and so on. I mean, so many factors. Does the body seem to have its own status independent of those factors? How can it? And then move forward to the present, to right now as you're sitting here on your chair or cushion, engaged in this meditation. And look at how the body appears to you now, and begin to think about all the various causes and conditions that are involved in the arising of the body at this moment. The food that you have eaten today that nourished the body, that allows the body to continue to function, to breathe, to circulate blood through the heart beating, to be able to move, to think, and so on. And choose any one of those, such as breathing, and think about everything that's involved in your breathing. All the various nerves in the body, the autonomic nervous system that keeps you breathing even when you're asleep. The air that is coming into your lungs that contains oxygen that has come from the plants in this world that have produced that oxygen. And think about where those plants all came from, all the various causes and conditions in them. Think about this kind of huge interdependence, this being that occurs on the basis of all of these causes and conditions that allows the body to be here right now. So again, spend a couple of minutes doing a similar focus on your existence at this very moment, meaning the body's existence at this very moment, sorry. Again, bringing this awareness of what you've been meditating on in terms of all these causes and conditions that have led to the body being here right now, your body. Observe the body and see if it seems a bit more elusive, not so independently existing, not sort of standing on its own. Now let's move to the second level of dependent arising, dependence upon parts. So here begin to think about the parts of the body, which once more we find to be infinite, because even if we go beyond grosser parts that we identify, such as the head or the torso, the right arm, the right leg, the left leg, and so on, we see that any one of those has many other parts. We have this idea of a whole, what we call the body, and then we have the parts of the body. And begin to examine how there are many, many, many parts to the body. Again, we can go down to a quite small level to find all the various parts. But as you investigate this once more, keep coming back to that idea of yet the body seems to have its wholeness. It seems to cover, as I said earlier, from the top of the head down to the bottom of the feet. But is there kind of a whole that exists independent of all those parts? As you bring all those parts to mind and look at them, we have a strong sense that there is a whole that they are a part of, that the parts are part of the whole. But aren't those interdependent? Isn't there a dependence for the whole upon its parts, for the parts upon the whole? How can there be an independently existing body, which is how the body seems to exist, as if it's got some sort of bodiness that covers the entirety of the parts? So spend a few minutes in silence doing that type of reflection, going into the investigation of the parts and then occasionally just popping back out to look at this whole idea of body and see how it appears at that time, to see if we can begin to appreciate the dependence of the whole, the body, upon the parts of the body. And you might even, as an additional exercise for this second level, do sort of a mental separation of these two to see if it's possible to separate the whole from the parts. Imagine on the left side all the parts of the body. Of course, they're all assembled in the way that your body is assembled. You know, the head on top of the torso, and the arms, the top of the or the to the sides of the torso, the legs and underneath the torso, and so on. All these various parts all assembled. And then something that we call body that is on the right-hand side, existing independently of that. Can it be established as absolutely independently separate from the parts of the body? Does it have its own status, its own ontological status as a phenomenon that exists, that is body, that is completely and utterly independent of the parts that are on the other side? You see that we can't even mentally conjure up what we mean by body without the parts of the body. So once more return to the way that the body appears to you now compared to how it appeared when we started the meditation, seeming to have some ability to stand on its own, to be self-established, to exist independent of the parts of the body. But we've come to see that no such phenomenon exists. The body cannot exist entirely apart from, separate from the parts of the body. And let's move on to the third level, the subtlest level of dependent arising, where we observe all these parts of the body that we were just analyzing, but we see them as essentially being the basis for what we call body. Just as in the way we isolated mentally, body and the parts of the body. Well, if we assume that body is simply a label, a designation that we're giving to these parts, well, then it shows very clearly how body exists in the end, in the final thought of the Buddha. It is just simply a label, a designation. It has a relationship to the parts of the body, just as any label has a relationship to what is labeled, the basis of that labeling. But it doesn't have utterly independent status. It exists through the force of that conception, that idea, that label, that imputation, that thought of body in relation to what is seated on the cushion or the chair that you're on right now. These parts of the body that are the basis for designating, and the designated label of body that we are putting on this, calling it in conventional terms so we can relate to it, so we can have some understanding of our world. But there's no real body then sitting on this chair or cushion. There are the parts of the body that are merely labeled, merely designated. So again, take a couple minutes to play with this idea and see if you can get your own way of approaching it to where you can begin to see the extremely subtle way in which body exists as a mere designation on the basis, the parts of the body. And while we're doing this, we might still have some feeling that the parts, the basis, has some sort of substantial or independent existence as what those various parts are. So let's just take the head. You're in your head, and look at the various parts of your head that are the basis for designation of the concept of head, based on having, a skull and the brain and the scalp, all the skin on the face, the eyes, the nose, the mouth, the ears, the neck, all of this part of the body that we call the head, all these various parts. These are the basis of designation for head. There is no real head among the parts or as the collection of the parts. Head is a label, an idea that we have, a concept to relate to the basis of designating the parts of the head, the eyes, ears, and so on. Can just play with that idea for a minute or so to feel kind of the looseness around how head appears, as if it has some sort of substantial independent existence. It depends in the end upon its causes and conditions, its parts, and finally upon us designating this collection of parts as head. And then we go one more step further to look at a part of the head, because once more, this is like peeling an onion. We have to keep going to make sure that we don't find anything to exist sort of on its own, independent of concepts, independent of parts, independent of causes and conditions. But at this level, just looking at the way that mouth is merely labeled. So your mouth is labeled on the basis of the parts of the mouth. The lips, the opening of the mouth, the tongue, the teeth, the upper palate, the lower palate, and so on. All the various things that constitute the mouth, the outside of the mouth, the inside of the mouth. Can you find a mouth that exists independent of that basis and independent, moreover, of us labeling it as mouth? Is there some sort of mouthness that exists somewhere on those parts or on the collection of those parts? Or can we come to see that mouth is also merely labeled to the basis of designation, all the various parts of the mouth? So then ask yourself that question, having done this bit of investigation in regard to the body and the parts of the body we've looked at. Can there be independent existence of the body? Can it exist in the way that it appears to us to have some sort of substantial reality when it in fact exists independence upon causes and conditions, all the various things that have led to this body to being here? It depends upon its parts, the head, the mouth, and so on, all the various things that constitute the parts of the body. And moreover, its bodiness is merely designated to this collection of stuff. It has no body from its own side. Body comes from labeling, designating. In this very subtle way, the body exists, merely imputed, merely designated. Nothing more than that. No substantial independent existence, therefore empty of that. Come to see the emptiness of the body through seeing the very subtle way that it arises in dependence upon mere designation, as well as parts, as well as causes and conditions. So again, I will post a little meditation, have Mary put it out on the Dropbox that was composed by Venerable Rabina that's just working with the first level, kind of seeing all the causes and conditions. And she goes into great detail around various things, and you can kind of do that sort of expanding out to see any one particular thing that's related to the body being here in terms of causes and conditions, how it itself has myriad causes and conditions. But I hope this was useful to kind of look at these three ways that get to this very subtle way that, as I mentioned previously, Nagarjuna relies upon this heavily. He says, because things depend upon causes and conditions, because this body depends upon the causes and conditions, that's enough to prove that it doesn't have any independent existence. Because if it wasn't existing inherently independently, it wouldn't need to rely upon anything, as I pointed out earlier. But it relies upon those causes and conditions. It relies upon the parts of the body. It relies in the end upon this very subtle way that we are simply designating this as body. There's no real body sitting on the cushion or on the chair right now. Body is merely a concept, an idea. So let's see if there are any questions or comments. Mary's very kindly put some of the events coming up on there, posted all of that. So thank you for doing that. Any comments or questions? You can unmute your mic if you'd like to ask a question, or you can put something in the chat box. I know it's hard doing these kinds of meditations in the evening, but I don't know, I kind of got into it. I like doing evening meditation for some reason, but I hope it was of some benefit. So. All right. Well, then, since there are no questions or comments, I will go ahead and do the closing prayers. But again, you can take any phenomenon, and as I said, we could have used the eye, but I think once more, there's something useful about the body, and since that's what Venerable Rabina uses, and that's the meditation I'm going to provide you, I thought it would be good to use that. We do so strongly identify with the body as I. When we see a picture of our bodies, which is really what a picture on Facebook or anything that anybody shows you, it's not really a picture of you, it's a picture of your body, but we very much go, oh, there I am, look at me, I'm in that photo with you. Well, is there a real I that is in the photo? There's the part of the I, which is the body, and the mind is there implicitly because the body's not dead, so the consciousness hasn't left, the body. But you still have this strong identification with that physical appearance, that outline of your body, the shape, the color of the various features, and so on. That's how we identify ourselves so frequently. So it's a useful tool to work with. So I encourage you to spend some time over the next week. Again, I'll get this to Mary. I apologize for not having done it earlier today, but I'm sure she'll be very happy to put it out there on the Dropbox for you. And you can pull that up probably tomorrow then. So, all right, let's go ahead and do some prayers and dedications. Again, I'm not doing the additional practices that we sometimes do on Sundays and Saturdays. I've been trying to do that as well. But please keep in mind that there are some practices that Rinpoche very much strongly encourages to do to protect yourself and others from this illness. So tonight we're just going to do the 2 dedication prayers that we generally do, thinking that through the power of what we've done here tonight, may this become the cause for my own enlightenment, the enlightenment of all beings, and then recalling bodhicitta how besides this wisdom of emptiness that we're working on in these evenings, we need that motivation to go with it, just as the bird to reach its destination needs two wings, the wing of wisdom and the wing of compassion. And this is about developing that compassionate wish that we be a benefit to others. May this grow very deeply in our own hearts and in the hearts of every single sentient being, including our leaders in this world. May they find this source of immeasurable compassion for others during this difficult time. Due to the merits of these virtuous actions, may I quickly attain the state of a Guru Buddha and lead all living beings without exception into that enlightened state. May the supreme jewel bodhicitta that has not arisen arise and grow, and may that which has arisen not diminish, but increase more and more. And then thinking about how much we depend upon our lamas, our gurus, our spiritual guides for our growth and development on this path, we make strong prayers for these three teachers in particular, as well as for all the teachers and guides that exist in this world, whatever their tradition is. If they are helping sentient beings to be free from some measure of suffering through practicing good morality and so on, may they continue to abide in this world, and may we and others always have perfect guides in our lives. The wish-granting, wish-fulfilling jewel, source of every single benefit and happiness in this world, to the incomparably kind Tenzin Gyatso, I beseech, may all your holy wishes be spontaneously fulfilled. You who uphold the subduer's moral way, who serve as the bountiful bearer of all, sustaining and spreading Manjunath's victorious doctrine, who masterfully accomplish magnificent prayers honoring the three jewels, Savior of myself and others, your disciples, please, please live long. Venerable One, to you whose kindness exceeds that of all the conquerors, for those wanderers in far-off places, especially the West, mindful of your loving concern for us in intentionally descending again into a family of a far distant land, we make this request. O Lama, please, please live long. And by virtue of those prayers, may we create the causes and conditions for us all to continue to have teachings and guidance, especially from Rinpoche and from Osohita. May they visit our center quickly and be free of any obstacles to doing that. Lastly, let's dedicate for all those beings that we're holding in our hearts, especially starting, of course, with those beings who are affected by this virus in our world, those who have died from it, those who are dying from it at this time, those who have succumbed to it in other ways, or hospitalized, or who have recovered, that they may have quick recovery. For those who are affected by it on the front lines, all the medical professionals, all the other people, even those selling groceries to people, people delivering mail, people doing all sorts of things that keep all of us with things that we need in our lives currently. I mean, this amazing network and web of beings that are involved in our welfare. May we dedicate for all of them to be free from their suffering and to find all the causes of true happiness. And then lastly, also hold in your heart those people who you know right now who are experiencing obstacles or illness, who are dying or who have died, and dedicate very specifically for their welfare, that they may be free from their suffering and find all the causes that will lead them to true peace and happiness. And may all beings achieve that state of perfect happiness through what we've done here tonight. Okay, thank you all so much. I really enjoyed doing this with you. Again, next week we will do one more meditation on emptiness, and I will also give to Mary to post the slides from tonight so that you can review those, the texts that I was citing, and review what concepts are behind this idea of dependent arising. And we'll do a meditation that will be working with production, I think is what I'm going to do. I know I haven't completely formulated that, but I think it's useful to kind of look at how things are produced and to see that very elusive nature behind things, and you can begin to see how things are merely labeled by virtue of that. So anyway, have a good week and blessings to you. May you stay safe and healthy, and I will see you again.